Hi there. Well, as promised, I'm going to give you a jump start to the bryophytes. And so we're going to be talking about the three groups that make up the bryophytes, just briefly a brief intro, a little bit about evolutionary relationships, and then finish her off with some life cycle talk. Okay, let's meet the bryophytes. By far, the largest and most diverse group are the mosses. And you're familiar with mosses. They come in many different flavors. So here's my friend up here, the top picture, Hylocomium splendens. And a Hylocomium splendens is called a feather moss because its branches are shaped like feathers. Here we have another species, and this is called a cushion moss because the shoots are upright and they form kind of a cushion. The liverworts are the second group, and the liverworts can be leafy, or they can be thalloid. So leafy means, of course, they have leaves. Thalloid means that they actually don't. They're just flaps of tissue that kind of creep around on the ground. And then we have the hornworts. And the hornworts are neat because their sporophytes, their spore-producing structures, are shaped like horns. So we're going to talk about those quite a bit later in the course. Wow, so this is the eukaryote tree of life, mostly made up of protists, which you probably already are familiar with. Humans and fungi and such are over here, and plants are over here. So let's take a look at those land plants and where they actually sit. And we can see that their closest relatives are the red algae there and the green algae. And so here we have our friends, the land plants that are made up of bryophytes and tracheophytes. Vascular plants. That's another name for vascular plants, is tracheophyte. And this illustration is kind of neat on a number of levels. One, it lets you know that land plants evolved from freshwater systems, and they also evolved from a group of green algae. And see here, the green algae here, these are called the charophytes, and one of the families in particular, the Zygnomataceae, are the direct ancestors of the land plants. That's kind of neat. Now the other thing that they're also showing is that there's probably a role of fungi in this terrestrialization. So that just means getting onto land. Anyhow, we're going to be talking more about that later. Okay, so if you've taken plant courses, this is probably the way that the bryophytes have been represented. The last 10 years, people have generally thought the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts were not really closely related, that they're individual lineages from the land plant tree. And but nowadays, it's actually thought that they're a monophyletic group, so that the hornworts, liverworts, and mosses all arose from one ancestor. So if you don't know what monophyletic means, you might want to look that up. Okay, they're all on one branch. They all arose from one common ancestor. Now, the vascular plants can also be called the tracheophytes. Okay, and they're the tracheophytes because they have a certain cell type that's part of the xylem tissue, so part of the vascular tissue. Okay, we'll come back and talk about that in a bit. Another cool thing you can do with phylogenetic trees is add labels to them. And this way you can show shared characteristics. For example, if we took a look at the pigments, took a look at what kind of photosynthetic pigments these plants have, we find that chlorophyll A and B actually were in the ancestors, and they're present in this whole branch of the tree. Now, something that occurred with the charophytes, those ancestors of the land plants, is they developed an asymmetric sperm, and they passed that along to their descendants as well. Oh dear, what happens though when you go on to land, right? You no longer have your cells all bathed in water. That's one thing, so you have to deal with desiccation. You also have to deal with gravity. How do you do that? You also have to deal with UV radiation. So there are a lot of characteristics that the land plants have that the algae wouldn't have. So for example, if we take a look at some features, Archegonia, Antheridia, and Sporopollenin, those are things that evolved as adaptations to life on land. So what are they anyway? So Archegonia are structures that house an egg. And so the egg is in the very middle of that structure, right here. That's the egg right there. And you can see it's got a nice cells that protect it. It's got a coat, an archegonial jacket it's called, that protect that egg. In algae, those eggs are generally just kind of exposed to the elements. We also have antheridia. We have a jacket that surrounds and protects the developing sperm on the inside. So that's kind of a neat innovation. Sporopollenin. Wow, sporopollenin is a really tough substance that you'll find on spores and pollen. So that's why it's called sporopollenin. And it's a chemical that prevents it from drying out and prevents it from being destroyed by fungi and bacteria. So very, very resistant. In fact, a lot of fossil evidence is based on sporopollenin because we can actually find it. Doesn't decompose. So those are important things. Those are important innovations. Now for gravity, the vascular plants develop vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. And as I mentioned to some of you, xylem, if you think of a big tree, the wood in the tree is the xylem. So xylem is a conductive tissue, vascular tissue, right? Our vascular system is our blood system that moves things around. And so vascular tissue in the plants does the same thing, but it has another function, and that is support. Now, bryophytes, well, they're sneaky guys. They stayed pretty simple, but what they did was they used other plants to grow on. So instead of having to grow big and tall to get close to the sun, they just grew on other plants. Or they can grow on the ground. They're very well adapted to low light as well. So kind of interesting things to think about, and we're going to talk about those more as we go through the course. Now, the other thing that is present in all of the land plants is sporic meiosis. If we took a look at Zygnumataceae, for instance, they had what was called, or they have what is called zygotic meiosis. Now, I really don't care if you know much about zygotic meiosis, but I do care if you know about sporic meiosis. So let's look at that. So sporic meiosis, another term that people use for sporic meiosis is the alternation of generations. And a special type of that is the alternation of heteromorphic generations. Okay, so basically what this means is you have two generations alternating, and they're different from each other. Okay? Before we take a look at that, though, let's think about what happens in humans. It's a good contrast because it's probably the life cycle we're most familiar with. And in humans, we only have one generation. It's us, right? So if we think about reproduction in humans, we have each of us has two complements of DNA, so we're said to be diploid, or 2N. We get one from mom and one from dad, right? And within us, we have the development of sperm, we have the development of eggs, right? And these are produced by a type of cell division called meiosis, and that results in cells, the gametes, the sperm and the eggs, both being haploid, 1N, right? Okay, the eggs and sperm, they fuse together to produce a zygote, and the zygote, of course, has one complement from the sperm, one complement from the egg, and so it would be diploid. So we're back to the diploid state, and that zygote will develop into an embryo by mitosis, so it's going to be diploid, and that embryo is going to develop into another human. So we really only have one generation, us. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens in the bryophytes, and we're actually going to take a look at moss as an example. And remember that the land plants, we're talking about the bryophytes as well as the vascular plants. They all do this whole branch of the phylogenetic tree there, the tree of life. So, of course, we're going to start with a spore, because it's sporic meiosis, and it is meiosis that produces the spore, and so, of course, our spore is going to be haploid. Now that spore germinates into a structure, so in the mosses it's nice and leafy, and that structure is going to be haploid, and it has a name. It's a generation, and it's called the gametophyte. And the gametophyte is called that because it's a phyte, a plant, that produces gametes, eggs and sperm. And of course they're produced by mitosis, and so they're haploid. Mitosis, producing gametes. That blows many people's minds, okay? Remember that. That is really, really key and important. Now, again, the eggs and the sperm, they fuse to form the zygote, and of course, that's going to be diploid. And that zygote in the land plants produces an embryo. So an embryo is a structure that gains nutrition from its parents. Okay, so that's actually a new thing too, isn't it? The algae don't do that, but the bryophytes and the tracheophytes, vascular plants, they do that. And that embryo will develop into a sporophyte. So that's another generation, and that's going to be diploid. So that's the other generation. And what does that look like? So here's a young sporophyte developing here, and you'll notice that it's stuck on the top of this gametophyte. So the archegonia, remember those are the structures that have the eggs in them, are attached to the female plant, and the zygote remains there, the embryo remains there. The sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte. It gets all its water, it gets all its nutrients from the gametophyte. Okay, and then it grows, and it has a little cap on top, and the cap, FYI, you're going to learn about this later, is haploid. It was part of the gametophyte. But then it gets shed off, and that sporangium that's underneath there opens up and releases spores. So that's a pretty neat little system, right? We have our two different generations. We have our sporophyte and gametophyte. We have this alternation of heteromorphic generations, right? So that's important. Again, another important thing is that embryo. That's a new thing. So another name for land plants is embryophyte, okay? And that's actually most commonly used in the scientific community for land plants, is embryophyte. Okay, so there we have our embryo right here, and we have our little life cycle that we've got to get used to here. But one thing I just want to mention to you is that the gametophyte is still really dependent on water. And we're going to find out it actually is for many reasons other than it has sperm that needs to swim in water. So we have this part of the life cycle that's still kind of stuck in water, but then we have this innovation, the sporophyte, that got kind of intercalated into a different kind of life cycle that is adapted for land. And we're going to talk more about that later, but if you think about it, the spores that it produces have a thick wall that's resistant to desiccation. So that's a really major innovation to life on land. And the whole sporophyte also is covered in wax. And so it doesn't allow any water to escape from it. It's modified for a drier lifestyle. Okay, so we're going to come back and talk about that later, but it's kind of cool. And of course, then we have our friends, the vascular plants. They have that xylem and phloem we've already talked about. Another term is polysporangiate sporophyte. And so if you think about a tree, think about an apple tree, think about all the flowers on that apple tree, right? There's many sporangia on that one apple tree. That apple tree is a sporophyte, and it's got many sporangia on it. If we take a look at the sporophyte of the moss here, it only has one sporangia, so it's called a unisporangiate sporophyte. Okay. The other thing that you might find mind-blowing is that the land plants that we see around us, the trees and everything, are the sporophytes. The sporophyte is the dominant stage or the dominant generation in the land plants. So the bryophytes have done things a little bit different. They have a dominant gametophyte stage and a shorter-lived sporophyte stage that's totally dependent on the gametophyte. And the vascular plants, well, they do totally the opposite. They have the dominant sporophyte stage. Okay, that's kind of cool. And I just did this little illustration just to show you. So here's a female plant here. There we have some archegonia, and there's male plants over here. In almost half the species of bryophytes, the males and females parts are on separate plants. So sexual reproduction, pretty precarious, right? Requires water. Whoa, look at that. To splash sperm close to the female, and hopefully there's a film of water there that the sperm can swim to the female. So pretty risky business, remember. The sexual reproduction is pretty much tied to water. Okay, so here's our life cycle. So this is called the sexual cycle, right? So there's eggs and sperm and all that kind of stuff happening. But bryophytes are aces at another kind of reproduction, asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction just means it's a cloning of the gametophyte. So we have genetically identical products of asexual reproduction, and it happens in many ways. And we're going to be talking about this later. Lab number 2 is actually kind of focused around asexual reproduction because we're going to be doing tissue culture of bryophytes. But the main one, of course, is fragmentation. So you can break bryophytes into itty-bitty pieces, and each little itty-bitty piece is going to grow into a whole new bryophyte. As I was mentioning to some of you the other day in class, yeah, some people phone me up and say, oh, I've been trying to get rid of moss out of my lawn. I always say, well, get rid of the lawn, get rid of the grass. But anyhow, yeah, but they'll say, oh, I raked it. And it's like, well, you're breaking it into little pieces, like little propagules, right? They're each going to grow. Some mosses have what are called cauticus, which I misspelled here, but that's okay, you'll get it spelt correctly later. Cauticus structures which have predetermined lines of weakness. So for example, in some cases you'll have whole little shoots that break off really easily, or little leaf tips that break off really easily, and each one of those will become propagules. There are also differentiated structures that whose sole purpose is for asexual reproduction, and these are called gemmae, and they come in all sorts of shapes, and you'll see pictures of those next day in lab, in class. Okay, so I think that might set you up pretty well. Okay, you might want to look at this again if you found it a little bit confusing, but you can always ask me. Anywho, we'll talk to you later, and have a great day. Bye for now.